Welcome, David from Boston. Amazing. All right, I got 8:03. I say we begin. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to tonight's discussion about the economic system. Thank you all for being here. We are the War Industry Resistors Network, and many of you know us from Mass Peace Action webinars and for our own webinars. Before we start the interview tonight, I would like to turn it over to one Mr. Paul Shannon, who will say a little bit about the War Industry Resistors Network, or WARN. And Paul, the floor is yours, my friend.
Well, thank you, Christian, and I'll be very brief because I know we want to get to Malaika as fast as possible. But I'll just say that as most of you know, all across the country and the world, groups are organizing against this military-industrial complex. They organize against it because of their work for a livable planet and for social justice and human solidarity, and because this military-industrial complex gets in the way, to say the least, of achieving these goals. But even though there are a lot of groups working on these issues of military contractors and their relationship to Congress and think tanks and all that, these efforts are generally isolated from each other. For instance, we did see last year a lot of student groups focusing on divestment from war companies. And that was very inspiring. But the problem was, again, there's no national coordination of these actions, and so they do tend to be isolated. Now, some of these groups belong to the War Industry Resistors Network. Our specific focus is on U.S. military contractors and the real and present danger they pose to our country and the world. Each group in our loose network focuses on one or more military contractors operating in their community. So far, we have not, however, been able to mobilize that network to take action together, and this is one thing we do have to figure out. I'm hoping that perhaps in Massachusetts, for instance, we're starting a divestment campaign of the Massachusetts State Pension Plan that is invested in these war companies selling weapons to Israel with the incredibly disastrous results. So maybe divestment, but something we have to keep thinking this through and figure out a way that we can do things together to bring our collective power to bear against these military contractors and against the interests throughout the country that benefit so much from them. Just the fact that these contractors are making such a killing as their profits are increasing rapidly as the genocide in Gaza has been going on. This cannot be allowed to stand. So let's keep on thinking how we can work together. For now, we'll stay in touch with each other and keep doing the best we can. And want to welcome everyone for the War Industry Resistors Network tonight. Christian?
Hey, thank you, Paul. That was awesome. And many thanks to Mr. Brian Garvey of Mass Peace Action, who is doing the tech work on tonight's webinar and holding this whole thing together. So thank you, Brian, as well. Now, without further ado, what is the economic system? What are its features? And what's war got to do with it? Fortunately, we're joined tonight by Malaika Jabali, author and attorney. Malaika is a fellow at New America and is the former senior news and politics editor at Essence magazine. Her writings have appeared in such outlets as The Guardian, Jacobin, Teen Vogue, The Intercept, and Current Affairs magazine. She is a graduate of Columbia Law School. Her debut book, It's Not You, It's Capitalism, Why It's Time to Break Up and How to Move On, centers revolutionaries of color and guides the reader through how to dump the economic system that we live under. Tonight, I will interview Malaika for about half an hour. Then we'll have a brief intermission when I offer possible tangible steps we can take. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We will try to go no longer than an hour total. So here we go. First question. First of all, thank you, Malaika. Welcome. To begin, please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to study the economic system under which we live.
Hi there. Hi, Christian. And hi, everybody, for joining this webinar. I'm really grateful and thankful that you've invited me into this space. It has been quite the journey for me getting here to writing a book about capitalism. We initially, when I was talking about it with my editor, we wanted it to center socialism, but we weren't sure if we wanted to put it in the title. And it's largely because we have been brainwashed so much in this country to not really consider other options. So it was like, how do we make this as fun and approachable as possible, and not intimidate people too much? But people, I feel, have had some sort of instinct. A lot of folks have felt this instinct towards capitalism not really working for them. And I was fortunate because I grew up, just to give you some background about myself, I grew up in movement spaces. And I came out of, some of y'all on this call, you may be familiar with this organization called Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, or the Jackson Plan, Cooperation Jackson. But all of that came out of this Black radical organization in Detroit called New Africa, the Republic of New Africa. And so this was a group of folks during the Black Power movement who came down to the South, and they said, you know what, we need to figure out how we can concentrate power. The civil rights movement is not working for us in these northern states where we have migrated, where we thought that integration was going to be the goal, which was going to lead us to a little bit more of equality. People saw that that didn't really happen. And so I am a beneficiary of that movement. They moved down, a good group of them moved down to Jackson, Mississippi. They created chapters throughout the South. Folks probably would not associate the Deep South, Atlanta, these Black belt states with Black radical politics. But it was essentially a socialist organization. I did not know that growing up. I didn't realize that until I was an adult. But there was this sentiment underlying that work where I understood as a young person that America was not fulfilling the promises that it had for people. And so there had to be something to radically get at that. And what that looks like varies for different people. It wasn't until I was an undergrad, so I went to college at Emory University outside of Atlanta, where it really started to come together for me. I was reading about the slave trade. I was an African-American studies and English major. I double majored in both at Emory. And it was studying Black history, and so I think part of the fear from a lot of the right and not studying American history or studying Black history is that you really get a study of capitalism by studying the slave trade, by understanding the construction of race. And so when I saw that you had these colonizers who created this idea of race, they invented this idea of race to make a profit. They conquered land and called people barbarians and called us Negro, even though we were all these different ethnicities and nations in West Africa. They dumbed it down and simplified us into this Negro race just to justify our enslavement. I was like, oh, so this is how we are able to fuel this engine. So I was specifically growing into my anti-capitalism around that time. And then there's a variety of experiences, lived experiences, plus formal education that made me embrace the idea that I was actually socialist. And we can get, into that a little bit later, but I studied neoliberalism in grad school, in law school. I went across to, I was studying in Amsterdam School of Law, where I was looking at comparative labor law and looking at our system of liberalism compared to these other governments who had a robust social welfare state. So a lot of that came together into us creating this book to make it easier for people to understand.
Thank you. Yeah, let's get into it. So how does the economic system, capitalism, work, and what are its defining traits?
In the simplest terms, it is an economic system where you have a relatively small number of owners, a small number of shareholders who own and make decisions about what happens in an enterprise. And they are profiting off of the labor of workers, of wage laborers. So there's kind of three sides to it. You've got these owners, they own the means of production, they make decisions about the company, the enterprise, whatever it is, and then they exploit labor in order to make a profit. That is, I think, it in a nutshell. And so what happens is that instead of, if we were to look specifically at industrial Europe, where a lot of this was happening, in industrial England, you had people who were moving away from being able to sustain off of their own land, sustain themselves with whatever it is that they produce. Now they're producing things for other people, and they're being concentrated into urban areas, into factories, into these mass things to produce with a few people. You know, you have one factory owner or a handful of shareholders or a board of directors. You've got this small group that's making all the decisions, while you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are actually producing the goods and producing the services.
And why is it so difficult for people, particularly many in the United States, to understand that the economic system is the problem? And what are some of the myths that swirl around, that capitalists themselves put out there, and that many of us indoctrinated, typically tell about capitalism? And please compare that to sort of the reality.
Yeah, oh gosh. I mean, the main thing is we've been brainwashed. I mean, that's why it's hard for us to accept anything else. And it's not just this, you know, some kind of conspiracy psyop. Through our educational system, we don't even learn about other systems. When I was in, you know, when you're in elementary school or even in high school or in college, if you not seek this information out, you don't even learn that there are alternatives to capitalism. The only thing I learned was that you had the Soviet Union, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, they were communists, and that's about it. But no one was really explaining what it actually meant, you know. And so I just kind of pulled away one thread, and that just led me to, you know, unraveling everything about what kind of unlearning all the things that we're told. Some of the things that we're told is that, again, part of thinking that capitalism is the only system is not being open, thinking that there are no acceptable alternatives. So that's a primary one. We don't even learn about it. We don't know how much socialism actually existed in the United States. We don't know how much socialism was incorporated into the civil rights movement. We don't learn that people like Martin Luther King, they had traits, they sympathized with democratic socialism. We don't learn that the March on Washington was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and that it was really founded by A. Philip Randolph, and a devout socialist, and Bayard Rustin, another socialist. So they were two heavy hitters in the labor movement who wanted to have their own march specifically for labor. And then they decided we need to incorporate this into a larger movement for civil rights. But when you even listen to some of their speeches, we only learn about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. We miss the fact, you know, that he and other speakers were talking about automation and the fact that capitalists were taking control even back then. We don't learn about the fact that Martin Luther King said that capitalism had seen its best days in this country and that there needed to be a revolution of values. So we just don't even learn our own history of how we have been, we've had radical influences in this own country. Another myth is that if you simply work hard enough, I mean, everyone knows this one. If you work hard enough, obviously you're going to be a capitalist, you're going to succeed, you're going to thrive. And when you look at it, there's a couple of professors who did a longitudinal study for about 40 years, and they found that 80% of the people who have been in the Forbes 400, so the richest Americans for 40 years, this was a period from about 1982 to 2012, 80% of them come from very rich families or upper middle class families. So wealth begets wealth in this country. Some of it stems from inheritances. Some of it stems from maybe, you know, your grandfather or grandmom, y'all got a lucky break some kind of way, and you were able to build wealth. And so we assume that all of us can be in there. And so maybe 20% might get there. But if you were to have a test, or you say 20% of people pass and they can become the richest Americans in this, 20% of anybody can do something, that's a failing grade. And so what my argument is as a socialist and in writing this book and having these talks is to say, I think we can do so much better than this. I think we can do better than 20% of people in this country truly thriving. Because even if you are upper middle class, you do everything right. I've, gone to law school. So many of my peers, they wanted to work in social justice and human rights. And I'm, a bit of a bleeding heart. So I was like, yes, I'll be mired in student loan debt, so I'll deal with it. But people have to leave that to go be another cog in the system and do some kind of corporate law in order to pay those loans back. And then you get used to that sort of lifestyle. So even if you do well in this system, you're still working really long hours. You might not like what you do whatsoever. You might not have family members who are able to thrive either. So there's so many myths.
I'll take this this opportunity to highlight the book right here. It's Not You, It's Capitalism, Why It's Time to Break Up and How to Move On. This was honestly one of the best books I've read in a long time.
Oh.
I bought a few of them and gave them, it was my Christmas gift to everyone, so I would give it out for Christmas. And yeah, it's huge positive feedback from everyone I gave it to. So I encourage everyone on this stream tonight to please pick it up. It's really worth it. And those myths that Malaika just talked about and many more are covered in here. It's very accessible. It's very comprehensive at the same time. And yeah, really a wonderful work.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that. It was a labor of love. And then just to address one quick myth, because I always get this, you're a socialist and you're selling things as, if it's not clear from the brief definition I gave, buying and selling things preceded capitalism. This is not about me being a factory owner, forcing people to write books for me. This is my own labor that I am selling, and people sell their own labor. So that is what I am doing with this book.
Good call. So why do news media often ignore people of color when covering the working class? Why is this, quote, whitewashing of the working class so important from the capitalist perspective?
Yeah, this actually dates back to Reconstruction, if not a little bit earlier than that. So something that I touch on in the book is a work from W.E.B. Du Bois, he was a communist. Again, something we don't learn about because we only think about him being in the Talented Tenth, but he was a whole communist, and he left America because he was so disgruntled with our economic system. But in Black Reconstruction, he talks about how during emancipation, when Black people were finally freed of, of servitude, of legal slavery, many of them were the traveling north. So you had some of the earlier periods of the Great Migration. And one of the most nefarious things about American enslavement is that it had to create a lot of myths about Black people in order to keep up its myths about capitalism. And so some of those myths that preceded even emancipation is that we were so lazy, that we were shiftless, that we were criminal, and we needed to be enslaved to basically save the rest of the population from our criminality, from our, from our villainousness. So we were not acceptable to be in the broader population. So when you have identified a whole group of people as not even just being workers, but not even fully being human, it's really easy for media, once those folks are legally free, to still maintain those same ideas and attitudes. And so when you had Black folks who were becoming workers, and this, I mean, if you think about it, these are millions of people who could have been incorporated into some of these labor movements in the North. But because of racism, from both labor leaders, from the general population, Black workers just were not accepted into the labor movement. And then you also have mass media at the same time that's painting Black people as criminals. So we're not really getting the same kind of empathy. And so a lot of that has continued where there is not really even this concept of Black people being workers, because we weren't even considered people. We weren't considered citizens. And so when we do get kind of accepted into labor in some ways, we're still considered competition for deserving workers. So you don't really want to acknowledge people when you think that they're competing for the little scraps that we get. So we have a really huge scarcity mindset in this country where if one group gets something, somebody else doesn't get enough, but we're not really focusing on the ownership class enough. So it's a lot of I would say the narratives are rooted. If you just read news articles looking at, how they defined and how they characterize Black people who are coming from emancipation, a lot of that stems from that.
And this divide and conquer helps keep us from uniting across racial lines and actually challenging the 1%, right?
Yeah, I mean, and just to add to that, thinking about it in contemporary terms, I mean, just last week, when you think about, I am pissed off. This administration is doing so much, but I'm trying to keep it together a little bit because it is frustrating to watch this unfold in real time. You do the studies, you read the theory, you write about it, and then to see it unfold. For instance, with all this focus on government efficiency and government waste and putting all the blame on DEI, what the Republican Party, what conservatives are saying is that people who are undeserving, federal workers who they try to paint as Black people or immigrants or queer people or women, they don't deserve to get wages from the government. People don't deserve food stamps. So instead of focusing on expanding our social welfare state, they're not even talking about inflation anymore because they know that is beyond their control for the most part. Donald Trump, where's all this talk about inflation? Now it's about government waste. And so you've got like regular middle class people who are like, well, you don't deserve food stamps, and folks are like policing other people for getting government benefits instead of us expanding the social net so everybody can get benefits.
And taxing the super rich in order to provide more and more. Yeah, rock on. So what is the role of racism in capitalism historically and today? We covered a lot of that. And what role does racism play in the US government's initiating and sustaining nonstop war? These wars all over the globe, from the drug war in Latin America to the bombing of Yemen, to the bombing of Palestine, to the militarization of the Pacific. How does racism factor in?
Well, when you talk about race and capitalism, it's essential. We would not, I can't, I'm not a fortune teller, so I cannot look back and say what would have happened without the slave trade. But we know that what we have right now is because of the racialization of people who had been sold into transatlantic slavery. And as we've already discussed, a lot of that came with justifying why there was this, mass migration. Now, all of a sudden, y'all don't want migrants, but y'all just stole a bunch of people to migrate to the United States to toil on this land. So you have this mass migration of people, and you have to justify that in some way, because despite what is, I think, the erasure and some of the revisionism that you might hear, a lot of people had problems with it. People had problems with the fact that the indigenous were getting wiped out. People had problems with the fact that slavery even existed. But in order to, and this ties into the second question, so I'm kind of going to answer them together. Cool. If you can paint a group of people as barbarians and subhuman, then it justifies why this system exists. So it's a means to an end. And I think that is how war operates in general, because it's not just about warring with people because, you're getting the defense contracts. It's also about what you're constructing on people's blood. So when you hear Donald Trump talk about, raising Gaza and putting a Trump Tower, that's always the second side of the equation, is how can you construct? How can you profit even more? How can you amass more and more wealth off of death and destruction? That is what, if you even look at low-wage laborers, in the industrial era, it was about denying people's rights. It was about allowing people to die for the sake of growing capitalism. It was about kidnapping and branding children, not just Black kids, but in Europe. There was a system of kidnapping children because they had run out of the adult pool of workers. So they would brand and enslave European children in order to work in factories. So this idea of racism stems really from racialism. So if you read Black Marxism from Cedric Robinson, he talks about this. So there is this effort of treating people as subhuman, and not just Africans. Europeans were doing it to each other. So he spent about 2 chapters talking about how there were these different subcategories of Europeans who mattered more than other people did.
Yeah, and we hear terms like terrorist and savage still applied today, in order to bomb from above and, wipe entire families off the map. And it's no different. Why do we not have democracy in the workplace? And what would democracy in the workplace look like? In chapter 4, pages 80 to 81, you write about worker self-directed enterprises. What are these? Please elaborate.
Mm-hmm. Democracy in the workplace is essentially this idea that we've got democracy, quote unquote, theoretically in the United States government, where you have a majority of masses of people who are able to have a vote, one vote, one person, one vote. So you theoretically are able to decide how our government operates. You elect your representatives. So why do we not have, this is a concept that economics professor Richard Wolff coined, worker WSDEs. He's got this great book called Democracy at Work. So if we have this that is commonplace in our ethos as a country, why has it not happened in our workplace where we spend most of our times? We don't spend most of our times in the voting booths. We don't spend most of our times, going to testimonies to be witnesses at public hearings. We spend most of our time at work. And we don't have that because it's not profitable to the capitalists who control not only our economic system, but in a lot of ways, our political system. So we would be able to probably incorporate more of these if there was more investment in them. But when you are rooted in, I think of capitalism as not just a system, but a culture. And when you have convinced people to believe in this culture of capitalism, we believe in privatization. We believe that the people who innovate and come up with some of these ideas, sometimes they're capitalists, sometimes they just are people who lucked out and, through inheritance or whatever, they inherited somebody else's ideas and they bought them. Somebody like Elon Musk, who a lot of times he's not an innovator or an inventor. They just buy other people's businesses and then they run them. So if we have been convinced that these are brilliant folks and they deserve all of the fruits of their labor through our culture of little c capitalism, then they're the ones who should get the benefits. So even if you work really hard, even if you're the one who actually understands the system, you know how to stock the warehouse, you know how to, load the truck, you know how to drive the truck. We don't believe that we deserve a say in that because we have convinced ourselves that we are not valuable enough for those roles. And so democracy at a worker self-directed enterprise is essentially a worker cooperative, but Wolff talks about how he wanted to distinguish it from cooperatives a little bit because it's not just that you own what you produce, but you also have decision-making power over how things are produced and how the enterprise is run.
Wonderful. And I encourage everyone out there to visit Professor Wolff's YouTube channel and his website, Democracy at Work. You can search in any browser. It's a wealth of information. And I just wanted to add that Malaika mentioned acquiring other people's, buying their businesses. And we see this all the time in the war industry. And to the extent that mergers and acquisitions are so common, the big five, the big six, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Boeing. A lot of their quote unquote innovation is just buying up smaller companies. And we see that all the time, to the extent that the Pentagon itself is put out a report within the last couple of years, just being like, this is ridiculous. We're paying you to invent, and you're not spending your research and development on research and development. You're either enriching the shareholders with dividend payments and stock buybacks to inflate the stock price, and you're buying up other companies, but you're not actually putting any R&D in yourself. And so, yeah, it's a pretty wild issue. The Pentagon, of course, didn't regulate these corporations. It just says hands off, but that's the beast.
Yeah, we like to just finger wag at these capitalists when they do wrong. They don't, there are no criminal liability, there's no criminality for them.
Right. Yeah. So how might worker self-directed enterprises apply to these war corporations, these military contractors? What beneficial products might a corporation turned cooperative create instead of a product of war?
I think that's a really great question. I mean, I think there are so many public spaces, and not necessarily like public as in owned by the government, but third spaces that we need to be creating. I think we have so much of, the modern era, the last 40 or 50 years has been dedicated to seeing things on our screens, just making technology as advanced as possible. And there's just a lot less, I think, human interaction. So what I think is so fascinating about socialism is that it can breed innovation. So we think of capitalism as doing that, but when people are so busy working 2 or 3 jobs or working really long hours at the one job that they do have, there isn't enough space to innovate. So I think, what the kinds of corporations that we can have, the kinds of cooperatives that we can have are going to vary depending on what our human imagination decides is possible. Personally, I haven't had a whole lot of time because I'm busy trying to, navigate this system. But I do think that we need more third spaces. We do need, investments in more public libraries. We do need more land that's dedicated to parks. We need to think about cooperative housing. So even though that's not a typical cooperative in the sense that they're creating a product or a good, but we need housing. So when we talk about the lack of supply for housing, it's usually, why don't we have enough private sector developers creating housing? Are there ways that we can model after Vienna or Singapore, where you have developers, people who are thinking cooperatively? That's actually what I wanted to do. I thought I would be a compassionate capitalist. That's what I thought I would do. When I was in grad school, I wanted to be an affordable housing developer. So that's one simple one. The sky is the limit. And I think with a system with people having more time to think about that, we'll be able to get in touch with what people actually need, not just kind of these, devices for consumerism.
Excellent. And it's worth mentioning the brilliance and the industrial nature, the industriousness of many of the workers who are currently tied up in the war industry. They're engineers, they're machinists, physicists, electricians, mathematicians. And right now, the capitalists, the 1%, are funneling these 99% into products of war. And they could be doing anything, like you said, they could be doing anything. So what was the Cold War, and what does socialism look like?
Yeah, so I touched on it a bit in my book. And mostly thinking about the Cold War was from the angle of how we had so much anti-communism in the United States. So it was basically a stalemate between the Soviet Union and the US, where they were battling to see who would be the superpower. And then obviously with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, those narratives changed. And so we didn't have as much anti-communism, but they were both arming themselves. They were both saying, okay, we're going to be able to have nuclear power. No, we're going to have nuclear power. So it was this rivalry. But even prior to that, prior to, the end of World War II, you had this this anti-communism that stemmed from being anti-Soviet. And again, the things that we're taught when we're in school is that this is just because, you know, they're led by dictators, they have a communist system where people don't get to decide things. But America, a lot of Americans were pretty neutral when it came to Russia, like in the early 1910s, 1920. It was seen pretty agnostically. It was only when Russia became a threat to America's dominance that we then started to see the kind of anti-communism associated with that. So a big chunk of where we get our propaganda is through that Cold War, and prior to that, around World War I as well.
The US government worked very hard during the Cold War to squash revolutionaries of color. For example, Fred Hampton right here in the United States, and as well as Pan-Africanist reformers like Patrice Lumumba. What is some essential knowledge that you've learned and everyone should learn from Black revolutionaries?
Yeah, I think what's helpful to know is that they come from societies where communalism was a cultural norm. And so tying back to what we believe are, I think, certain truths under capitalism is that this is human nature. It's human nature to be greedy. It's human nature to look out for yourself. It's human nature to look out for just your nuclear family. But folks like Patrice Lumumba, Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, they come from communal society. So preceding even this idea of, you know, Marxism, they come from places where the idea was I am because we are. So it wasn't individualistic. It was I'm going to thrive because my community thrives, and with my community thriving, I will thrive. And so I think looking at revolutionaries, not just in on the continent, which is I center them quite a bit because that's, you know, that's where my understanding of communalism came from, was looking at my ancestors, but in Latin America as well. So when you look at places like Bolivia, communalism is a part of the Constitution. They come from these societies where they don't think that because somebody else benefits, I can't benefit. It's not a zero-sum game. So I think embracing a different culture, recognizing that not only is this not the only option in the future, but this is not necessarily it's not a historical fact that this has been a ubiquitous type of looking at the world. We've had so many different types of worldviews, and looking at that history allows us to forge a way forward.
Thank you. Let's take a quick intermission right here. I will put some links in the chat. I'm first putting the Democracy at Work link in the chat so everyone can click on it, bookmark it, and do more research on their end. And I will also put information about other non-capitalist or anti-capitalist political parties in the chat. This is not an endorsement of anybody. This is just options that you, the viewer, can think about and dive into. So some of these are Socialist Alternative, Party for Socialism and Liberation, DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and the Green Party. I'm putting their links in the chat right now. Oop. Excellent. As well as, so learning history, as Malaika has taught us tonight, is so important, and in part because we don't want to repeat it. So I'm also putting in a YouTube playlist regarding the Black Panther Party and the federal government's, the US federal government's efforts to crush them. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, a link to Malaika's book, published by Hatchet Book Group. All right. Let's get right back into it. And we'll wrap up with a few questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So here we go. Capitalist politicians are no friend of the people. And this current administration, occupying the White House in particular, is positioning itself as virulently anti-worker. So how do you recommend that anti-capitalists forge ahead today as we are in February, early 2025, Malaika?
I think spaces like this are important. What capitalism does to us so readily is make us feel alienated from other people, makes us feel like we are inadequate, that if we do not achieve certain things, that it is solely because of our own personal responsibility. So I think being able to be in community with people, other people, who are thinking radically, who are thinking proactively, is very important. I've been a part of, like I said, I grew up in the movement. So I don't know a reality that does not come with, going to some organizing meeting, talking to people about what's going on in the news, trying to organize around a certain issue. I don't even know what what that looks like. So I'm a part of an organization that's based in New York, even though I live in Milwaukee right now, where we have something called Liberation Saturdays. So it doesn't matter who the president is, because whether it's a Democrat or Republican, until we can get another party in there, they're all capitalists. And so we are always, at least for the last 50 years, we're dealing with fundamentally, at least on a national level, anti-worker parties. So how can we carve out the space where we are and organize where we are, and really gather and fellowship where we are? Because I think that spiritual help, that sense of community helps us mentally to get through this, because this is a webinar about war. We are in a war. We are in physical wars. We are in violent wars. We are in class wars. It's a war on our mind. It's a war on our psyche. So being with people who are reading, who are studying, who care, who have empathy, we can't be in isolation. So that, all of that to say, I think having spaces like this where we are not in isolation, and we can not feel nihilistically about our futures, are important. And then what does that lead to? So we're not just here just to rah-rah and have fun and chop it up with each other. How can we connect that with politics? How can we connect that with local politics? I think on a federal level, America is so vast, and it feels very unwieldy. So I worked in municipal government. When I graduated from law school, I practiced as a public policy attorney for the New York City Council. There's so much that can be done on a local level. What are city council budgets looking like? Where are they getting their money from? Can they invest in worker cooperatives? Can they at least field a study on what worker cooperatives can look in that city government? Are they contributing to defense contractors? Where are their retirement funds going? Are they accepting, making sure that Medicaid is funded, that education is funded, that money isn't going entirely to cops on a disproportionate level, and that they're going to community organizations? So there's so much to do on a local level. And I could talk about that that's like a whole nother session.
Yes, it's so important. I love how you said basically, like, we're not alone. You're not alone out there. It's so important. So how are other countries trying to implement socialism today?
Yeah, so the way that I look at it, when people ask me, okay, well, where has socialism worked and what does socialism mean? Socialism is really an experiment. We have not seen it fully develop in the ways that a lot of socialists have thought about it. When you think about a lot of the African leaders, many of them, Assata Shakur has this great quote. She talks about how there wasn't a single colonial struggle in Africa that was not a socialist struggle as well. So a lot of these decolonial movements were socialist. So unfortunately, through coups, through military intervention and all these things, we weren't able to see it fully realized in a lot of places. I think in the way that we think about socialism in a contemporary way, which is where workers have power. But we see socialisms. And so I think a way for us to think about socialism moving forward is not necessarily, I mean, we can still think about it as, this class war where people are, there might be some violent mass struggle. I think that can always be a part of the conversation. But how can it be incorporated in more tangible ways? So I think about a place like Milwaukee, where I am based. It had the longest string of socialist mayors anywhere in the country. People wouldn't think that. Wisconsin is thought of as, real America, the Midwest, where they don't do any of that woke stuff. This was like the pinnacle of woke because you had more socialist mayors than anywhere else in the country. And they made sure, just a small thing, we have so many parks and trails out here because you have people who were elected into government as socialists, who then also made sure that you had socialist, parks administrators who said, we don't need every inch of land dedicated to profit. Everything doesn't need to be a real estate endeavor. Let regular people just enjoy green space. So a way, and I know this was about socialism in other countries, but this is kind of a similar idea.
No,
We
this is
have it
great.
right here, and we've also, in other countries, even though they may not have been fully socialist, if you look at Bolivia or Ecuador, if you look at, parts of Western Europe, I benefited when I studied in Amsterdam. I benefited from a nonprofit healthcare system, even though it's considered private. What they don't tell you, when some Americans say, well, they're capitalist, they are a capitalist country, but their healthcare system is actually a nonprofit system. So they're not looking to squeeze every ounce of money from you. So when I had an accident, the ambulance picked me up. They were so apologetic about the bill. That bill came out to like $500. And this was an emergency with an ambulance, with emergency surgery, $500. Like, we can incorporate things like that to make people's lives easier.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I didn't know any of that about Milwaukee until I read your book. So thank you for that. So last question. What is a socialist vision for the future? And what might a socialist economic system look like here in the United States?
So if I could be a genie and say
Yes.
that we had a truly socialist world, it's one that is more green. It's one that, it was like a mini Milwaukee, where you are able to have, without the inequality, where you have green space, where you have opportunities to breathe, where people have a chance to thrive. Not a chance to thrive, but people will thrive, where folks can embrace the things that they actually love doing because they're not dedicating every minute and every hour to making money for a capitalist boss. It looks like people having time for art, if they want to do that, having time to nap, having time to do and live however and wherever you want without exploiting other people and land. So, socialism on I guess, a less macro level looks like what workers decide it's going to look like, because ultimately it's a democracy, right? So when you have, let's say, a socialist enterprise, what it looks like is, hey, you have a group of workers who run, let's say, a warehouse, and they're able to meet and decide, this is how our profits are going to operate. We're going to have a vote, and we don't need the person who invented this company to get 10,000 times more money than the median worker here. Let's have a vote, and we can all agree on them maybe getting 10 times. I'm sure they can survive off of that. So ultimately, there's parity, there's equity, there's a sense of democracy and purpose, and there's participation in what our government and our world looks like. Because right now, you have a few people calling the shots. We're calling that democracy, and we have completely skewed our economic system and our wealth because of that, because only a few people get to decide how most of us live. And that's a completely unjust way of existing in this world.
Malaika, thank you so much for this. If it's okay, we'll take a few questions from the audience and then wrap up. Is that cool?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, so let's open it up to the audience. I see Jeffrey Barkdahl has his hand up. Jeffrey, if you're there, chime in.
I'm here. Hold on. Okay, listen. I I do have questions in the chat box that I could answer, but I'm gonna say these out loud.
Just
Out
one,
loud.
if it's okay, just general rule, one question, please, no comments, and make it brief and concise, please. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Sorry, I'm just having children decide between whether to share that Hmm. You heard of the patriotic millionaires? I know I shared this with with all of you a couple of times before.
This is
I think
your question is,
would you believe it's time for them to do more than just try to fix the tax system? You think it's time for them to actually try to fix the American system? If you don't know what they are, they're a group of. Do you even know what they are in the first place?
I don't.
Hey, let me tell you who they are real quick before I get to the quit. They are a nonpartisan organization of Americans with high net worth who promote the restructuring of American tax systems so that wealthy people pay a greater share of their income in taxes. And the qualifications of our members require either $1 million in annual income or more than 5 million in assets. And these guys are true patriots. So my question is, do you think it's time to involve them in more than just fixing the tax system? Do you think it's time to fix the entire not just the economic system, but also the entire American system as well? Stuff that you guys promote Massachusetts Peace Actions from is trying to fix. Isn't that right, Cole?
So to answer that, I would say it's sure. If there are any millionaires who want to be class traders and recognize that they have an obscene amount of wealth and they need to put more into public funds, then absolutely. I will say that America's treasury doesn't just come from the taxes of millionaires. They also print money. So a lot of it is about America deciding that it has certain priorities. And so I do think that involves changing the culture of how our U.S. government operates, the way that Congress operates, where they put more money into defense contracts, and they just print money for that. They don't even need to get it from millionaires. Even if every billionaire decided they wanted to be taxed fairly, they could still print money to still do dangerous and inhumane things, and have certain priorities where they're still not meeting the needs of the masses of people, even if they are. And I do hope that we get to a point where we are taxing millionaires and billionaires as they should be, more proportionately to their wealth. But yes, there needs to be a complete, as Martin Luther King says, just a revolution of ideas, a revolution in America's just overall worldview in order for us to be able to benefit.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Moji, you have a question, sir.
Aha. Okay. Hi, Sister Malaika.
Hi
My
there.
name is Moji Agha. I am an Iranian American Sufi Muslim peace activist and social justice activist. I work with here in the Boulder, Denver area with folks with Democratic Socialist chapter, as well as with folks who are trying to build a public bank of Colorado. So in terms of creating spaces and institutions that bring us together, part of what I'm doing is called Chambers of Compassion versus, or in contrast with, Chambers of Commerce.
Mm.
And the 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 I guess the question I have, I hope you look at this and contact me, but it's in the chat. The question I have is, I believe that first we need to get the civil society to be defragmented. Our civil society, and our society is atomized, as Karl Marx said, in Advanced Capitalism, society is atomized, and our civil society is highly fragmented. So we need to defrag the civil society but as a prelude for political organizing. So my question is, I believe we need the civil society to help or to work for the civil society to get defragged, and then there will be political organizing coming out of that critical mass that we need to create. So comment, please. Thank you.
I agree with I think that overall, I don't know, what percentage of the country needs to be refragmented or, reorganized together in order. I don't know what the turning point is going to be for this amount of coalescing that needs to happen for us to be able to have a mass movement. But I do believe that ultimately there has to be mass movement, and that does not happen with people who are atomized and fragmented. To what extent that needs to happen, how much of our society needs to get there to do that, when you think about the civil rights movement or some of our other movements, it didn't necessarily come from millions of people coming together. It came from a few committed people, a relatively few committed people to a cause. So you do need a level of organizing. It remains to be seen how much will be the tipping point and the catalyst for it to actually reap some benefits.
Thank you, Moji. Mr. Paul Shannon.
Oh, I got to press this thing here. Okay. Malaika, I heard from you that you have been in Milwaukee studying the situation of Black working class people. I just wanted to find out from you, what are some of the main findings that your research has led to?
Yes. So this was my little throwaway comment earlier, that as much as Milwaukee has had this history of socialism and progressivism, because of the strength of corporations and capitalism throughout America, a city and a state that relied so much on manufacturing obviously had an economy that cratered for a lot of people relying on those jobs during the deindustrialization era. So just to give people a very, kind of quick summary of what this book is about, the working title is Will It Explode? And it explores really the exploding dreams of the Black working class in the Midwest, specifically Wisconsin, because so many people moved up here for greater job opportunities. But when those jobs left, it impacted Black people here arguably more than anywhere else in the country, because they relied more heavily on manufacturing. So there's economic insights that I've gleaned from the research here, and there's also political ones. So Wisconsin had the lowest Black voter turnout in its state history in 2016. And so when we think about how are we getting to this place where Donald Trump is a viable candidate for 10 years? A lot of it isn't because people are rushing to him in places like Wisconsin. He's benefiting from low voter turnout in some states. Wisconsin was one of them. So in 2016, both the white and Black voter turnout declined. The Black voter turnout declined more than it ever had, which led to Hillary Clinton losing by a nominal, maybe like 22,000 votes. And in 2020, when that was supposed to be, this big, turning point for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, the Black voter turnout was even worse. So when folks feel like the government isn't working for them, a lot of them check out of government altogether. So this is really a story about how political economic disillusionment leads to political disillusionment.
Well, that's it. I promised we would end at 9 o'clock, and it looks like it's 9:02 according to my computer. So I first of all wanted to say thank you very much, Malaika. This was an absolute treat for us. This is her book. It's Not You, It's Capitalism: Why It's Time to Break Up and How to Move On. Please purchase it. Please pick it up. It is a wonderful, wonderful read. One of the best books I've read in a really, really long time. We have another webinar next month with investigative journalist Matt Kennard. and you will be, if you're on the WIRN or MAPPA email list, you'll be getting an email about that. And I want to say thank you to Malaika, thank you to Paul Shannon, thank you to Brian doing the tech work, thank you to Cole, thank you to MAPPA, Mass Peace Action, and yes, one love.